just gather together for a group photograph. Thank you. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, our plenary session 8 panelists on technology, innovation, and R&D. Thank you very much. We move on to our next session, which is the plenary session 9, Balancing Growth and Inclusivity. We'll just quickly make the arrangements on the dais. To be sustained over a long period of time, the growth process of any country must ensure that it benefits every individual and reaches out to every enterprise. It should also be regionally equitable as well as globally and sectorally stratified, and the least developed countries face particular challenges in enabling robust growth forces and shifting to more productive sectors that will boost incomes and generate better quality jobs. Micro, small, and medium enterprises, which comprise the majority of businesses in economies across the world, can deliver major gains provided they are empowered with finance and digital resources. Our panelists for this session are Mr. Bob Sternfels, Global Managing Partner, McKinsey & Company, the US. Mr. Martin Schroeter, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Kyndryl USA. Mr. John Denton, the Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Sun Qiao, the Secretary General, China Chamber of International Commerce. And to moderate this session, we have with us Ms. Rupa Purushothaman, Chief Economist and Head of Policy Advocacy at Tata Sons India. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. We're on to the session that discusses balancing growth and inclusivity. Rupa, it's over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on balancing growth and inclusivity, and thank you for being here with us today. I'd also like to thank our wonderful panelists for joining us and sharing their thoughts on what is probably the most important topic that we can talk about. So, when we think about inclusive growth, it's really been the foundation of the B20 deliberations this year. And rightfully so, right? Because if you look across this decade on nearly any measure of inequality, we have been seeing inequality increase, right? And when you look over the last few decades, sort of take a longer term view, inequality looking between countries may have been getting better, but inequality within countries has been worsening. And so we really need to take a look at really what's driving these trends. I think the other big thing, and why this is so important right now, is that as we look forward, right, we're sitting amidst a group of sort of trends that are really posing serious challenges to inclusion. One would be geopolitical fragmentation, right? And so the idea of increasing trade protectionism, and what does that mean for countries, especially developing countries, to really pursue an export-led strategy for growth. And the other big thing that I think is important is climate, right? Because whenever we think about climate impact, extreme weather events, really these things are hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. And so the trends are really pushing for inequality to exacerbate. And what I think we want to explore in this panel is what can we do, what concrete actions could really put inclusion at the center of growth. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to give each of our panelists 5 minutes to share some opening thoughts, and then we'll open it up for a more moderated Q&A between all of us. So I'll start with my extreme left. We have Bob Sternfels, who is the global managing partner of McKinsey. And then sitting next to him is John Denton, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. To my right is Sun Zhao, who is the Secretary General of the China Chamber of International Commerce. And all the way on my extreme right is Martin Schroeder, who is the Chairman and CEO of Kyndryl, which is the world's largest provider of IT infrastructure services. So looking forward to hearing from all of you. Maybe we'll start with Bob.
Super. Well, thank you, Rupa, and it's great to be here on the panel. It's good to see everybody, and great to see everybody in the audience. I wanted to just offer a few thoughts to kick this off, and I would start with first the assertion that inequality is the number one issue that we face globally today, the number one issue. And on the one hand, I think we all know that in the last 30 years, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. Rupa, to your point, 60% of global growth is now driven by lower income countries. So cross-country, the income gap's narrowing. But however, 70% of the population that's alive today, 70%, lives in a country where the income gap is widening. And I think this is the existential question of our time. And if you look at some of the specifics, take the US. The middle class has shrunk by 18% in the last 20 years. Go to China. In China, the top 10% of the income population have grown 50% faster than the bottom half. In India, that top 10% have grown 100% faster than the bottom half. So the data's there. What this says is we need to have economic growth. It's the catalyst that allows us to solve all the problems that we've spent the last day and a half talking about. But that growth has to be inclusive. It has to be inclusive. And I'd argue that it can be. And let me give you a few proof points. And I'll start with women. A year ago, our Women in the Workplace report valued what would happen if we could get to gender parity. And there's $12 trillion of economic value if we can get to gender parity. $12 trillion. That number accelerates to $28 trillion if you actually say women would play identical roles to men in enterprise. $28 trillion of inclusive growth by solving gender access issues. Look at minority groups. We launched an institute called the Black Economic Mobility Institute, focused on black economic opportunity in America. And our first report from this institute said in Black America, there's 1.6 trillion US dollars of economic opportunity by providing access to black enterprise and solving black consumer needs. Finally, rural to urban. By 2050, the urban population grows from 55% to 70%. And if you look at India, by India's 100th birthday in 2047, there's an opportunity to move 220 million jobs from farm jobs to non-farm jobs with a massive increase in wage escalation, which would drive inclusive growth. So these examples show growth can be inclusive. Let me offer 3 ideas for how to do this. And the first is broader participation in the capital markets. We did some work that showed if you were a wage earner or participating in capital, from 1945 to 1990, the appreciation was roughly the same. It didn't matter if you were a wage earner or capital appreciation. From 1990, that diverged. Wage earners on average escalated at 11%, but capital markets at 60%. If you weren't participating in the capital markets, you got left behind. So how do you solve this? It's ideas like Ownership Works, which is a nonprofit that we're a founding member of that's committed to providing equity for all workers. And they have a goal by 2030 of creating $20 billion of wealth for wage-earning U.S. working families. It's also SME growth, and John and I actually collaborated on an aspect of SME growth around global trade finance. But SMEs are 95% of the firms in the world today, and they account for 70% of the jobs in the world. But they lack two things. They lack access to credit, and they lack access to markets. 40% of applications for credit for SMEs are denied. And SMEs face enormous barriers in trade. We looked at just the finance aspect that said there's 1.6 trillion of value if we can just make it easier for SMEs to trade across borders. The last, and I think Martin would agree with this one, is there's an opportunity for inclusive growth through accelerating technology. We did some work looking at the value of generative AI around 67 specific use cases, and it shows there's $3 to $4 trillion of annual revenue available just in these 67 use cases. But the reason this is inclusive growth, if you take America alone, there's 12 million jobs that need to be reskilled to capture this value that cause a massive appreciation in the wages for those 12 million jobs. So done well, growth can be inclusive. This idea of access to capital, stimulating SME growth, and accelerating technology might be part of the pathway there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here. Might just take an opportunity. I'm an Australian occupying the role in Paris of International Secretary General, but I've got a shout out to all the Australians here. I'm actually delighted about the level of engagement by Australia in the India G20. Well done. But also, I have to make a big announcement. Many people don't know that Marty is also an Australian citizen, so we've discovered that we're actually dominating this panel. He, of course, spent time in Australia and discovered that as a US citizen, there's no better citizenship to actually aspire to, but to marry in Australia. So well done, Marty. Bob, you made some amazing points. When I just think back to when I took on the role of Secretary General of the ICC, one of the first campaigns I ran on a global basis, trying to link together this extraordinary network of almost now 55, 60 million businesses now I've actually got us in more than 170 countries, was to mobilize through campaigns. And one of the first campaigns I ran was actually to stop the global rise in inequality. That was 5 years ago. And I remember addressing a pretty significant and very large business meeting in Berlin, where I was attacked actually for turning a business organization into an NGO by talking about inequality. But as you say, and I think it is becoming increasingly clear, this is now a number one issue because from a business perspective, what we're finding and what we're seeing is it's undermining support for open market settings. And it's making it very easy to identify the wrong targets. And one of those targets is actually trade. And so I think the way you put it is very powerful and it actually is playing out in a real world, real-time issue. And of course, when you think about inequality, this has not been diminishing. COVID and now the problems we're having with the global implications of the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia is it's also exacerbating inequality. And it's hurting big time in emerging economies, hurting very big time, and I might come back to that in a second. The purpose of the ICC is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. It is an inclusive purpose. We chose this when I reanimated the ICC very deliberately because we don't see trade being balanced with growth, being balanced with inclusion. We see it as an integral vector. We see it as critical. And I think you also make the point, and I think I also make the point as well, that if you look at the rise in inequality and the lack of inclusiveness we're seeing over the last few years, that is actually aligned to the consequences of COVID, the consequences of Ukraine, etc., and even still the detritus coming out of 08, 09, where protectionism now is actually increasing and is exacerbating inequality, frankly. And so we actually want to reanimate trade, not in terms of you must trade because it's good for you. We're talking about trade as an important driver to decrease inequality and increase inclusivity. And that's really important. When I was just in Africa with the ICCs in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and next week I'll be with the teams in Mexico, actually in Guadalajara, all the way through LATAM. And the issue we're seeing on the ground there is how do we actually help businesses trade across borders? Only 2% of SMEs in Latin America actually trade across borders. Do you realize the economic potential there? But also when you look at this rise in inequality and you look at the consequences of the downturn in trade, who's being hurt? And you made some very interesting points about gender participation. I see it on the ground in Lagos, where you have women traders who can't get their stuff across borders because they have no certainty about whether they're going to be hit with a duty or, frankly, a bribe. So these are real non-tariff barriers going on as well. So we've got to actually turn that around and see trade as a positive force for improving communities and improving families. We've got to humanize trade. We've got to see it as the critical vector. And this is a discussion I'm having with Ngozi. We've just created a business advisory group at the WTO for her because she wants to change the narrative. Globalization is not dead, but we have to talk about new forms of globalization, re-globalization, and we've got to actually really focus on the human dimension here about how you lift people up out of poverty. And also, I think we all know the numbers, but the reality is that helping companies trade across borders require countries to participate in a system that actually is steady, stable, and is predictable. And that's actually a common good that we should continue to work for. So that's what we're interested in. I think in the Q&A I want to talk a little bit about some really practical things that the G20 should be doing, particularly around the capital adequacy and the way in which it's playing out for SMEs. But I might just pause here and let others go for it. Thanks a lot.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to join this panel and to see you all. Just now, my ICC colleague, friend John Denton made his comments in the global context, and I'm from the China Chamber of International Commerce, so I'm also a member of the ICC family, so I would like to speak from the China perspective. The concept of inclusive growth is long embedded in the Chinese culture. There is an old Chinese saying that it is more pleasant to play the music among the people rather than to play it alone. So you see, we already know the importance of common prosperity. And we all agree that the ultimate goal for growth is to increase the happiness of the people rather than to increase the deposit in your bank account. So no one will feel happy to live in a poor neighborhood and in a bad environment. So there is no contradiction between growth and inclusivity. And I will put it under three-dimensional relations: the human and nature, the human and human, and China and the world. Firstly, human and nature. China has already stated that we will reach carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. For a big country with a big population, this is really a big challenge. But we will work on that. We have made a lot of investment in green energies and renewable energies industries. And now we are the biggest producers of solar panels and electronic cars, not only to meet the Chinese market, the booming market, but also to supply the world. And secondly, the human and human relations. From 2013 to 2020, China made significant efforts to alleviate poverty. Almost 100 million people were lifted from poverty according to the United Nations standards. And we completed the poverty reduction goal of the United Nations 2030 SDG agenda 10 years ahead of the schedule. And the business communities are also getting involved in this endeavor. There are around 100,000 Chinese companies mobilized to help 10,000 villages across the country with a total investment around 100 billion RMB or 18 billion US dollars. Chinese companies have become put more and more emphasis on the CRS and ESG goals. And the third is the China and the world relations. Our President Xi Jinping already put forward the concept of one community of shared future for mankind in the United Nations General Assembly in the year 2015. The thought were accepted by many meetings and were recorded in different United Nations documents. This is a commitment of China to the world and has shown our position as against trade protectionism, North-South divide, digital divide, and etc. So we will highly appreciate and support the theme of G20 India this year, One Earth, One Family, One Future, because we share the same core value. The whole world is a family. You will not see your family members in poor conditions and you refuse to give a hand, right? So to me, growth and inclusivity is never contradicted. It is a matter of your attitude, and it will be more balanced if the business community can give a big hand. Thank you.
First, thank you, Rupa, for inviting me, and thanks to the B20 and the Confederation of Indian Industry to putting this together. First, it's really clear, I think you've heard from all the panelists, this is the issue that we need to address, and it's not one where we have to make a choice between growth and inclusivity. They are so supportive of one another. They're quite complementary. Just a little bit by way of background, and you, Rupa, you gave us a little bit of, you told people a little bit about who we are. We were a recent spin out of a large tech company. As Rupa said, we're the largest infrastructure manager in the world. We're roughly 85,000 people in 60 countries, and we're number 225 on the Fortune 500 list, and we're not quite 2 years old yet. So we're like the world's largest startup, and we run the infrastructure that runs the systems and the processes that you use every day, the banking systems, the airline reservation systems, the telecom networks, et cetera, et cetera. So as an example, here in India, our customers, the customers for which we run their systems, touches about 1 billion people in the way we interact and they interact with their customers. So just a little bit about us. I want to pick up on what Bob said, because I completely agree with him that technology is part of an answer here. And while we've talked briefly about trade, I want to narrow that discussion to digital, because the world is digitizing. And the good thing about technology and this particular challenge around inclusion and growth, technology can help solve this challenge. So just look here in India as an example, and what this government is accomplishing in bringing people into the economy through really two sort of straightforward approaches. One is to connect, and this government has deployed advanced networking technologies and 5G in order to bring more people and connect them to the internet and give them access to technology. And the other is to educate. And there's an opportunity here for public and private to work together to help that education process. So once the technology is deployed, that the consumers, the citizenry is comfortable using it. And then as a private employer, there's an opportunity here for us to deploy education and create the skills and create the credentials to allow these systems to operate smoothly and securely and in a resilient way so people can trust them to do, again, their most important work. So in the issue of our time around inclusivity and growth, technology plays a real role. We see some very good models around the world of what's working, including right here in India with connection and with education. And there's a role, obviously, as I said, for private to not only help those efforts, but also to deploy skills and create skills so that people have long-term, high-paying jobs in careers that are meaningful, and they become part of a system that should, quite frankly, be working for more and more of us. I'll turn it back, Rupa, to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We've been asked to end our session at 1:15, so that means we have about 10 minutes for our Q&A. So this will be more like a rapid fire or medium rapid fire Q&A. But I'll start with Bob. I think, this has been brought up almost by everyone, but this question of increasing trade protectionism, we're seeing export restrictions, investment screenings. How can we think about, particularly for developing countries, to navigate an environment that has changed dramatically over the last 7 or 8 years, to think about a strategy for growth that will work for them?
Well, first, I would be very clear that, that these types of restrictions are an inhibitor to the topic that we're talking about. Right? If we really want to lean into inclusive growth, trade plays a vital role in that. And John had mentioned Ngozi, and as soon as the kind of pressures about do we deglobalize came out, she commissioned a report at the World Trade Organization that said, what would be the cost of some of this? And the first estimate was about 5% of global GDP. And by her own admission, it was a narrow definition. So we had our McKinsey Global Institute take a deeper look at this. And we looked industry vertical by industry vertical, went 6 levels deep, and to Martin's point, took a broader definition of trade, not just physical flows, but data flows and talent flows. The reality is anywhere between 20 and 40% of our global GDP is at risk if we really inhibit trade. Right? That's massive. And that has a massive regressive effect in terms of inclusion when you look at one of the other trends. I mentioned that about 2/3 of today's global growth comes from the global south. That grows to 70% by 2050. So to the notion of the perspective on this, accelerating opportunities and growth is critical. Maybe one last comment on this. We ended up looking, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is trade wasn't that resilient. And so with exogenous shocks, we saw supply chains were pretty fragile. One of the things we've looked at is the diversification of trade. Diversification of trade and the multiplication of trade routes does a couple things. One is it makes the world more resilient. We have more options. But second is it drives economic growth that is particularly inclusive. So as you start to think about multiplication of trade routes as opposed to concentration of trade routes, there may be an answer here in inclusion, but it does require reimagining about connecting, not deconnecting.
That idea of multiplication of trade routes is really interesting. John, can I ask you a little bit more in depth, since you have centers of excellence around SMEs? What are some practical obstacles for SMEs in terms of being able to achieve their full potential?
Wow, I mean, what I would just add, if I could, on what Bob said, by the way, on this issue of protectionism. I think one of the keys in the process of the G20 is a failure to articulate clearly what a deliverable we want from the G20. And I think it's always one of the challenges. And if I can, on the issue of protectionism, there needs to be a clear deliverable. And the trade ministers have done some good stuff in the last 48 hours in terms of doing some work on digital that we have advocated for, so we're very happy with that. We're very happy that they've reasserted the primacy of the WTO, very happy with that. But going to a fundamental, the way in which protectionism is being played out now is actually pretty sneaky. There's an illegitimate use of some of the provisions under the WTO agreement around health, around subsidies, around national security, all of which, I'm saying illegitimate, not illegal, all of which are creeping. So what I'm saying the WTO should be doing is what they did at the early days of the G20 is mandate the WTO sorry, the G20 should mandate the WTO to actually bring to each G20 a public, transparent analysis of all the protectionist moves that are existing during the course of a year. Sunlight is very helpful in this process, because then I go to the issue of inhibitors. I mean, we're doers. I mean, I've just created, over the last 12 months, 14 centres of entrepreneurship on a global basis, and we'll do more. Because we also think part of the truth about inclusive growth is giving everyone the ability to start their own businesses, irrespective of which economy they come from. And those 14 are in the global south. And the ICC now, I've reweighted it, almost 70% is in the global south. So these are big issues. But an issue that people need to grapple with there, particularly SMEs, what they find, is a lack of transparency. They don't know how you actually navigate. And so improving the investment in some of those tools, there's an accountability, transparency tool also at the WTO, but also this commitment to stability in the public policy settings, and then the way in which this operates on a global basis, going back to why I do think the multilateral trading system is not dead, but is actually critical, maybe needs a bit of a kick, but it actually needs to work, because it does make a difference for SMEs moving across. And by the way, never forget that when a country like Somalia was negotiating for accession to the WTO, it wasn't a theoretical issue about improvement. There would be an immediate uplift in economic activity in a country as fragile as Somalia, which would make a huge difference to SMEs, communities, and to families. So that's about the WTO. There's actually a human aspect to its success. But the point I really wanted to get to, and I'll be very brief on this, because it's another WTO, another G20 deliverable. The G20 is responsible in many respects for the financial regulations to ensure we don't have another systemic shot to the global financial architecture. That's the mandate to the Bank of International Settlement. That's what the Basel III is all about. But what's happened is the context in which that was put together, 08, 09, is different now. What we're seeing is, frankly, some perverse outcomes. So if you think about it, capital adequacy rules, the way they operate, this is something I think the G20 can and must do something about. They do not allow a company in an economy to have a higher credit rating than the country's or the economy's credit rating, which may have made sense in terms of 08, 09 to protect the whole system. But now, of course, look what's happened. I sit on this global crisis response group that Guterres put together. I'm actually working on the financial side of the finance crisis. What's happened now is that you've seen this series of sovereign downgrades. And what that means is that the private sector there, fully functioning businesses, cannot get access to finance because of the way in which the Basel III capital adequacy rules operate. Now, this is something that the G20 can actually do something about, which would have a practical impact, because at the moment, those SMEs will be investing in renewable energy, SMEs will be leading opportunities for women-led entrepreneurs, etc., cannot get access to business, and they're perfectly legitimate, functioning businesses because of the perversion in the way in which this rule applies. So I think that is a clear deliverable, and it's a practical impact.
Thank you, John. Martin, I just want to ask a question about the economic participation of women. And I think for you, as a company that has grown quite dramatically in the last 2 years, how have you thought about being able to incorporate women fully in the workforce? And also thinking about the future of work, remote work, this could either pose a positive outcome, or it could be a big challenge for this question of women in the workforce. What do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, the future of work is an unknown. It's going to be a massive exercise in human behavior, and each of us, for us in particular, where our entire business is built around getting the right people and getting the best people, we're going to have to continue to provide agency to people. But I think that also helps, Rupa, to get into some of the challenges that each of us faces, particularly in technology, where we tend to have women underrepresented. We do well within our industry, but we don't do well compared to some of the best in the world. Let me step back for a second, Rupa, because I think what two of my fellow panelists talked about is really important from a policy perspective, and that is, as Bob said, well, the world is digitizing, and so the digital trade policies that governments put in place become very important. And obviously, every government has a role in protecting its citizens' data, their personal data, making sure it's secure, making sure it's resilient, et cetera. But most of what we deal with is non-personal data. And so we're very active, as many of our peers are, in making sure that governments engage and get digital trade policies with regard to non-personal data right, because there are very few things that could have a bigger impact in the near term than creating the right digital trade policies. So once again, we get more people connected into the economy. As an employer, in addition to advocating for good digital trade policy, and by the way, there are plenty of good examples of what good digital trade policy looks like. So governments are getting this right in lots and lots of places. As an employer, we also have an ability to influence and to address this through policies around maternity leave, policies that really reflect the challenges that bringing women into the workforce or keeping them or retaining them in the workforce meet. So we, as an example, again, we provide a lot of agency to our people so that they stay with us and allow them the flexibility they need, the autonomy they need to meet the challenges of day-to-day life. So there's a policy element as an employer that certainly helps. And then there is a discrete effort to actually to meet people where they are on this career journey, whether that's education, whether that's skills. We have to reach them where they are, and many times that means you have to go, for instance, in India, which we do now, you have to go to the next tier of cities or the tier of cities after that. We have to educate people in the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a role for us to play in terms of influencing policy, because digital trade policy done well can be an enormous enabler to bring get people engaged into the economy. And then as an employer, how the policies we put in place to support women in the challenges that they face and to meet them where they are with regard to skills, with regard to education, and give them the agency need can have an enormous impact on starting to address what is clearly something that we as a technology industry are a bit behind in.
Sure, and I just can't not speak on this topic. I just think one other really concrete idea when we think about women in the workforce, especially in a place like India, at the national level, is to sort of reimagine a public care infrastructure. I think that can do wonders and probably be one of the biggest boosts to GDP. We have to close. I'm going to ask one last question to Sun. If there's one lesson that China can provide in terms of poverty alleviation for the rest of the world, could you share that with us, and then we'll close?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Rupa. As the time is running, I will be rather short. Starting from 2013, we send our people to those villages to help them. And these people need to live there for at least 2 years. And if one term is finished, newcomers will go there to stay another 2 or 3 years. Not only by doing this that we can find path for their development. So the lesson is that to teach them how to fish rather than to give fish. One more lesson is that after 2020, the campaign for poverty alleviation is finished. Another plan we called the Rural Vitalization Plan is continued. So this is a long-term work. We need to continue, just like planting trees. You need to hold the tree long enough until the root grasps the land firmly. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my panelists, and thank you everyone for listening to us. I hope we've come up with some good concrete ideas on this very vast topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupa. May I request you to please present tokens of appreciation to all our panelists. They're just coming up here. And if I could request our panelists also, then after you've received your gifts, to please stay on for a group photograph. Please stay on. If you could look towards the photographers, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a break now for lunch. Lunch is arranged in Shah Jahan as well as Raja Bagh. Please be back here in 45 minutes for the next session that will begin on time at 2:15. Thank you very much to our panel and to Rupa Purushothaman, who's steered that very ably. Please join us now for lunch in Shah Jahan as well as Raja Bagh, and please be back here in 45 minutes. Thank you.